The last time I saw my father truly alive, he smelled of cedar wood and turpentine, a scent I've equated with safety and love since I was a child. His workshop was the only place the illness hadn't touched. Here, surrounded by the ghosts of 1,000 forests, he wasn't a patient. He was Arthur Vance, the master craftsman, a man who could coax stories from slabs of oak and whisper secrets into the grain of mahogany. The late afternoon sun poured through the high, dusty windows, illuminating the air like a cathedral, and in that golden light he seemed almost whole again. He ran a trembling hand over the unfinished frame of a rocking chair, its curves as elegant and fluid as a line of calligraphy. "They see the finish, Elara," he said, his voice a low rasp, a shadow of the booming baritone that used to fill this space. "They see the polish, the price tag. But you and I, we see the grain, we know what's underneath." He looked at me then, his eyes still so sharp and clear, searching mine. He wasn't just talking about wood, he was talking about people. He was talking about Isabel, his wife, my stepmother, and he was talking about her son, Julian. For the last 2 years, since the diagnosis, they had circled him like well-dressed vultures, their concern a little too loud, their smiles a little too bright. They had begun to streamline the business, as they called it. They replaced the old craftsmen who had worked with my father for decades with younger, cheaper labor. They swapped out solid wood for veneers in the commercial lines. They spoke of profit margins and market expansion, words that tasted like ash in my father's workshop. I saw the slow motion theft of his soul, and it broke my heart. "Julian was in here yesterday," Dad said, turning his back to me to pick up a hand plane. The tool, worn smooth and dark with a lifetime of use, was a part of him. He was talking about digital fabrication, 3D printing our designs. He let out a short, bitter laugh that turned into a hacking cough. I rushed to his side, my hand on his back, feeling the frail birdcage of his ribs beneath the thin flannel shirt. When the coughing subsided, he leaned against the workbench, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "He doesn't understand," he whispered, "that the imperfections are the point, the mark of the hand, the soul of the maker. That's the signature, Elara. That's the legacy." He looked around the workshop, at the blueprints pinned to the walls, my designs mingling with his, at the tools hanging in their perfect order, at the stacks of fragrant lumber waiting to be given life. This wasn't just a business to him, it was a living, breathing thing. But next to it was a small, intricately carved wooden bird, a tiny wren, no bigger than my thumb. It was the first thing he ever taught me to carve when I was 7 years old. My clumsy, childish hands had struggled, but he had guided them, his patience endless. "The wren is to remind you where you came from," he said softly. "The key is for where you must go. There are things in that desk. My first sketchbooks, my private journals, things they wouldn't understand. Things for you." He closed his hand over mine, his grip surprisingly strong. The warmth of his skin felt like a final, desperate transfer of strength. "Promise me something," he implored, his gaze intense. "This place, Vance Design House, it's not just a brand, it's our story. Your grandmother's embroidery, my woodwork, your designs, it's all one thread. Don't ever let anyone else tell our story for you. Protect it, even if you have to burn it all down to save its soul." A cold dread washed over me. It felt like a premonition, a final warning from a man who knew his time was short and the wolves were at the door. I saw the fear in his eyes, not of dying, but of being erased, of having his life's work, his very essence, twisted into something unrecognizable. I promise, Dad, I choked out, tears blurring the golden light of the workshop. I'll protect it, I promise. He nodded, a fragile peace settling over his features. He seemed to shrink then, the brief surge of energy leaving him, and I helped him walk the short distance from the workshop back to the main house. Isabel met us at the door, her smile perfectly manicured. Arthur, darling, you shouldn't be tiring yourself out, Ilara. You know he needs his rest. Her voice was like honey laced with arsenic. She wrapped an arm around him, leading him away, and cast a look back at me over her shoulder. It was a look of triumphant ownership. In her eyes, he was already gone. I was already an outsider, standing there on the threshold between my father's world and hers. I held the small wooden wren in my palm so tightly its sharp edges dug into my skin, and I felt the cold, hard weight of a promise that I knew, somehow, would cost me everything. My father's funeral felt like the first official marketing event for his death. Isabel had curated it with the same soulless precision she applied to a new furniture collection launch. The flowers were tasteful but scentless, the music was somber but forgettable, and the guests were a carefully selected blend of industry titans and financial reporters. I stood by the grand fireplace in our family home, a stranger in a black. I drifted away from the crowd, my feet carrying me on autopilot towards the library. This was where the will would be read. The room was panelled in dark cherry wood that my father had always said was too severe, too impersonal. It was Isabel's choice. She had filled the shelves not with books to be read, but with leather-bound volumes arranged by colour. It was a room designed to impress, not to comfort. Our family lawyer, a man named Marcus Davies, was already there, his face pale and drawn. He had known me since I was a little girl, had once given me piggyback rides on that very Aubusson rug. Today he wouldn't meet my eye. He just fidgeted with the thick vellum document in his hands. Isabel and Julian entered last, closing the heavy doors behind them with a soft, final thud. A small, select group of board members and family friends were seated, their faces carefully neutral. I wasn't nervous about the contents of the will. My father and I had discussed it many times. The house, the stocks, the liquid assets, those would be divided. But the heart of the company, the creative directorship, the workshop, that was my birthright. That was our shared soul. I was prepared to hear my father's final wishes, to feel his presence one last time in his words. Mr. Davies cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent room. He began to read. The initial clauses were exactly as I'd expected. Isabel would receive a controlling interest in the company's shares and continue as CEO. Julian was named President of Operations. Then my name was mentioned. To my beloved daughter, Ilara Vance, I leave my personal sketchbooks, my tools, and my workshop, and entrust her with the creative future of the Vance Design House as Chief Creative Officer. A wave of relief washed over me. I squeezed my eyes shut, a silent thank you sent into the ether. But Mr. Davies hadn't stopped reading. His voice faltered. However, he said, the word hanging in the air like a guillotine, a recent codicil, signed and notarized last month, supersedes this clause. He took a shaky breath. Isabel sat a little straighter, her hand resting delicately on Julian's arm. The codicil reads as follows, he continued, his voice now a monotone, as if he were trying to detach himself from the words. Upon recent and careful reflection of my daughter Alara's disposition, and with concern for her emotional volatility and lack of practical business acumen, I have come to believe that the immense pressure of a leadership role would be detrimental to her well-being and, consequently, to the stability of the company. Therefore, I retract the previous appointment. The codicil stripped me of everything. The workshop and its contents were now company property, under Julian's control. My designs, past and future, were declared work for hire, and therefore also belonged to the company. I was to be given a compassionate stipend of $5,000 a month for 1 year only, on the condition that I did not contest the will or cause any reputational damage to the family or the business. It was an eviction notice and a gag order, wrapped in the language of paternal concern. When he finished, he finally looked at me, his eyes filled with a deep, mournful pity. I looked down at the signature page he had turned towards us. There it was, Arthur Vance. It was his name, his handwriting, but it was dead on the page. My father's signature was a living thing, a confident, artistic flourish. This was a perfect replica, but it was hollow. It was a forgery of the highest caliber, a soulless copy. Isabel rose and came to my side, placing a hand on my shoulder. Her touch felt like ice. "He loved you so much, Elara," she whispered, her voice a performance for the room. "He just wanted to protect you, to set you free, to be an artist, without all these burdens." I flinched away from her touch. I looked at Julian. There was no pity in his eyes, only a cool, dismissive finality. This wasn't a tragedy for him. It was an agenda item, successfully checked off. The promise I made to my father echoed in my mind, a frantic, screaming thing. Protect it. Don't let them tell our story. And in one fell swoop, they had stolen the pen, the ink, and the very paper it was written on. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and walked out of the room. No one said a word. The silence followed me, a heavy shroud, all the way to the one place that still felt real. I pushed open the door to his workshop, and the familiar scent of cedar and turpentine filled my lungs. The afternoon light was gone. The room was cold and dark, and for the first time I understood. I was utterly, completely, and irrevocably alone. The first time Isabel met me, I was 12 years old, and she gave me a beautiful porcelain doll with wide, unblinking blue eyes. "She never closes them," Isabel had said, her voice smooth as silk, "so she can always watch over you." It wasn't until tonight, standing in the cold silence of my father's chaotic creativity, she'd mused to a visiting board member. "Elara feels the art. It's a gift. Julian," she'd said, smiling at her son, "has the discipline to translate that feeling into profit. They make such a wonderful theoretical team." At the time, I thought it was a clumsy compliment. Now, I see it for what it was. The first brushstroke in a portrait of me as the unstable artist, and Julian as the steady hand. She was planting the seeds of my incompetence, in the very minds that would one day hold my fate in their hands. And Julian. Julian was her perfect apprentice in this quiet, brutalist art of erasure. He couldn't design a coaster, but he was a master of repackaging soul as a brand. I remembered the fight we'd had last year. I'd spent months on a hand-drawn blueprint for a complex, heirloom-quality desk, with intricate joinery my father had taught me. Julian had taken the blueprint, scanned it into a computer, and presented a simplified, flat-pack version to the board a week later. He called it Democratizing My Vision for the Modern Consumer. My father, already weakened by his first round of treatment, had been swayed by the profit projections. When I protested that he had stolen the heart of the design, Julian had just smirked. I didn't steal it, Elara. I made it viable. There's a difference. These weren't isolated incidents. They were a strategy, executed with the patient, bloodless precision of a chess master. Every suggestion to my father, every public compliment that subtly diminished me, every design of mine that Julian streamlined. It was all part of the long game. They hadn't just stolen my inheritance. They had spent years convincing my father to give it to them. The codicil wasn't a last-minute betrayal. It was the final, triumphant move in a game I never even knew I was playing. Fueled by a cold, clear rage, I walked back into the house. I found them in my father's study, my father's sanctuary. Julian was already sitting behind the mahogany desk, scrolling through something on his laptop as if he'd sat there his whole life. Isabel was directing two movers who were carefully packing my father's personal collection of antique woodwork. Your father was a brilliant artist, she said, walking over to the decanter on the sideboard and pouring herself a small brandy. But he was a sentimental fool. He was running this company into the ground with his nostalgia and his refusal to evolve. We were honoring his legacy, not destroying it. This, she said, gesturing around the room, was a course correction, a necessary one. So you forged his name? You lied? We guided his hand, Julian cut in, leaning back in the chair. He was sick, Elara, confused. We helped him do what he was too weak to do himself. Protect the company from his worst impulse, which, I'm afraid, was you. He picked up my personal sketchbook from the corner of the desk, the one I'd left there last week. He flipped through the pages with a bored indifference. These are beautiful, truly, but they're drawings, not a business plan. It's time for the adults to take over. That was the moment the last of my grief turned to stone. The civilized shock of it, the sheer audacity of him holding my soul in his hands and calling it a child's scribble. You have two choices, Elara, Isabel said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You can take the generous stipend we've arranged, find a charming little apartment downtown, and play at being an artist for the rest of your life. Or you can make a scene. in which case we will be forced to release a statement about our deep concern for your mental stability following your father's tragic death. The media would have a field day with the story of the hysterical, grasping daughter. Your name would be mud in this industry before you could even try to start over. She opened a drawer in the desk and pulled out a file, a press release already drafted. The betrayal was so complete, so multifaceted, it was almost a work of art in itself. I said nothing. I just turned and walked to the door. Your personal belongings will be sent to a storage unit, Julian called after me. HR will forward you the details. Security will see you out. I didn't look back. I walked through the halls of my childhood home, past the ghosts of my real mother, of my father, of myself. At the front door, a man in a uniform I didn't recognize was waiting. I walked out into the cold night air, the massive oak doors clicking shut behind me. I had nothing but the clothes on my back and a fire in my chest that was so cold it burned. They thought they had left me with nothing. They were wrong. They had left me with a purpose. 24 hours ago, every distant siren felt like a personal accusation. I was a ghost, haunting a city that had been my home my entire life, yet I had never felt so alien, so utterly invisible. My first act of naive desperation had been at an ATM. I still had my wallet, my cards. I inserted my debit card, the one linked to my personal accounts, and the screen flashed a cold, impersonal message: card deactivated. I tried a credit card, declined. They had been ruthlessly efficient. I was not just disinherited, I was digitally executed. Every tie to my old life had been severed with the clean, quiet hum of a server. The stipend they had spoken of was a mirage, a cruel piece of theater for the benefit of the board members in that room. There was no money waiting for me. There was nothing. I wandered for hours, a directionless, numb shuffle through streets I no longer recognized. The city lights, once a source of comfort and inspiration, now seemed to mock me with their warmth and brilliance. By the time the first hints of a grey dawn threatened the sky, I was exhausted, hungry, and terrified. I saw a sign on a modest brick building, a faded purple dove painted above the words, "The Haven, a shelter for women." Swallowing what was left of my pride, a bitter, gritty pill, I pushed open the door. The inside smelled of bleach, boiled coffee, and a faint underlying scent of collective despair. It was loud, chaotic, and jarringly alive. Women of all ages moved with a weary purposefulness, their faces etched with stories far harsher than my own. A woman with a kind, tired face behind a pane of thick plexiglass took my name. "Elara Vance," I said, and the name felt foreign in my mouth. A label from a life that had ended. She didn't recognize it. To her, I wasn't a Vance of the Vance Design House. I was just another piece of human driftwood washed up on their shore. I was given a thin blanket, a small bag for toiletries, and a bunk number, bunk 27B. That night, huddled on the thin mattress, listening to the symphony of quiet sobs, restless sleepers, and the distant rumble of the city, I felt the true, crushing weight of my new reality. This was rock bottom, a place so deep and dark I couldn't even see the memory of light. I pulled the thin blanket over my head and finally allowed myself to break. The tears came silently, a hot, desperate flood for my father, for my home, for the girl who had believed in promises and birthrights. As I lay there trembling, an older woman in the bunk next to me leaned over. Her face was a roadmap of a heart, but it kept me from being swept away entirely. The only thing I had managed to grab before security escorted me out was the sketchbook Julian had so casually discarded on the desk. It was in my tote bag, its familiar weight a comfort and an agony. I pulled it out. Under the dim yellow glow of the shelter's nightlight, I opened it. The pages were filled with my life, my dreams, my father's legacy. Designs for chairs, lamps, tables, each one a conversation I'd had with him. Seeing them was a fresh wave of pain. This was everything they had stolen. This was the soul they were currently stripping for parts. My first instinct was to tear the pages out, to destroy it before they could. But then my fingers traced the lines of the last thing I had drawn. A rocking chair, the one my father had been working on in the workshop. His notes were in the margins, his familiar scrawl next to mine. And I realized Julian was wrong. He could steal the book, but he couldn't steal the knowledge. He could own the paper, but he couldn't own the ideas. The very essence of my art wasn't in this book. It was in my mind, in my hands. It was the one thing they couldn't touch. A strange calm settled over me. The grief was still there, a cold, heavy stone in my gut, but something else was stirring beside it, a flicker of defiance. I turned to a fresh blank page. My hand was shaking, but I gripped the small pencil from the book's spine. I thought of the cold park bench, the impersonal ATM screen, the brokenness in the eyes of the women around me, and I began to draw. It wasn't a chair or a table, it was a line, sharp and angular, like a shard of glass, then another, intersecting it. I drew a shape that was fractured but not weak. I drew a design that incorporated its own breaks, making them part of its strength, like the Japanese art of kintsugi, where broken pottery is mended with gold. It was a design born of this place, of this moment. It was stark, minimalist, and unforgivingly honest. They had taken my name, my home, and my future. But on a cot that smelled of antiseptic, with a pencil that was worn down to a nub, I began to draw a new one. In business, your enemy's enemy is your greatest potential asset. My father had only one true rival, a man he called the Shark, a predator who moved silently through the deep waters of high-end design. His name was Silas Blackwood. While my father built with warmth and nostalgia, Silas built with glass and steel and brutal honesty. And was immediately stopped by a receptionist who looked like she'd been carved from ice. She dismissed me with a practiced, polite disinterest. I came back the next day and the next. On the third day, instead of asking for a meeting, I handed her a folded piece of paper. On it, I had drawn a detailed technical solution to a cantilever issue in the public benches his firm had recently installed in the Seaport district. A minor but elegant flaw I'd noticed on my walks. Give this to him, I said. Tell him it's from someone who also believes form should follow function, not just fashion. I didn't expect it to work, but 20 minutes later, the ice queen called my name. Silas Blackwood's office was at the top of the tower, a corner space with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a godlike view of the city. The room was empty, except for a single black desk, 2 chairs, and the man himself. He was older, maybe 70, with stark white hair and eyes the color of a stormy sea. He held my drawing in his long, slender fingers. "This is either very clever or very arrogant," he said, his voice a low, gravelly hum. He didn't invite me to sit. "Who are you?" "My name is Lena," I said, the lie feeling surprisingly natural. Ilara Vance was dead. "I'm a designer." "I'm aware. You've been haunting my lobby for 3 days." He gestured with the paper. "This is a good solution, an Arthur Vance solution. Elegant, structural, a little poetic." "I take it you studied him?" "I studied everyone," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "I believe the traditional luxury market is stagnant. It's bloated with sentimentality. It's ripe for disruption." A flicker of interest in his cold eyes. "Is that so? And you're the one to do it?" He stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the city. "The Vance Design House owns that market. Isabel Vance is a shrewd operator, and her son is a master of marketing. They're sharks in their own right." "They're marketers," I countered, stepping forward. "They sell a story about craftsmanship, but the story is a lie. The soul is gone. You're selling expensive, well-packaged nostalgia. There is a gap in the market for something new, something honest, something sharp." I opened my sketchbook and laid it on his desk, turning it to the kintsugi-inspired designs I had drawn in the shelter. "This is my work. It's about the other firms have teams of $20 and million budgets. You have this room, a standard materials budget, and 2 weeks. Impress me." Those 2 weeks were the crucible that forged Lena. I slept on a cot in that workshop, fueled by coffee and a burning, singular focus. Silas was a relentless mentor. He didn't teach, he interrogated. He'd walk in, glance at my progress, and dismantle it with a few curt questions. "Why that joint? It's weak. Have you stress tested the material, or are you guessing? Your supply chain for this wood is unethical. Find another." He forced me to learn digital modeling, sending me a link to a tutorial and expecting mastery by morning. He made me write a full financial projection for the project. "Art is a beautiful indulgence, Lena," he told me, circling a flaw in my cost analysis with a red pen. "But business is what keeps the lights on so you can afford to indulge. The Vances know that. If you want to beat them, you have to be smarter." I was no longer just drawing. I was calculating, sourcing, engineering. I was building on my father's foundation of art with Silas's framework of brutal commercial logic. I cut my long hair into a sharp, asymmetrical bob. I traded my soft bohemian clothes for a uniform of black and gray. Ilara Vance was the gentle curve of a hand-planed chair. Lena Petrova, a name I chose for its sharp Slavic edges, was the unforgiving angle of laser-cut steel. On the final day, I presented my prototype. It was a desk, but it was also a statement. I had used reclaimed wood from a local shipyard, reinforced with a spine of recycled steel that was visible, a deliberate part of the design. It was beautiful, but it was also indestructible and cost 30% less to produce than the initial estimates. Silas circled it slowly, running his hand over the surface. He tapped the steel spine. You didn't hide the mechanics, he observed. The strength is the point, I said. It shouldn't be hidden. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something that wasn't skepticism in his eyes. It was respect. I'll fund you, he said simply. We'll set you up with your own studio, a new brand under the Axiom umbrella. We will build you into the ghost that will haunt the Vance design house until its foundations crack. He handed me a key card. Welcome to the war, Lena. I took it, the cool plastic heavy in my hand. Ilara Vance was a girl who had lost everything. Lena Petrova was a woman who had nothing to lose. And that made me the most dangerous person in the world to the people. Ilara Vance was a memory, Lena Petrova was a blueprint, and I was finally ready to build. Our brand launched not with a party or a press release, but with a single perfect object. We called the brand Petrova. Its first product was the desk I had designed for the library competition, the one with the steel spine and the reclaimed wood. We didn't market it. We simply sent one to the 50 most influential architects and tech CEOs in the world with a simple card bearing our logo, a stylized kintsugi crack. There was no name, no face, just the work. The work was the message. The message was honesty, strength, and innovation. While Julian was putting the Vance family name on overpriced, mass-produced perfume lines and paying celebrities to be photographed on their latest, vapidly ornate sofas, I was building an army in the shadows. Guided by Salas's ruthless strategy, Petrova became the antithesis of the Vance design house. We didn't court their old money clients, we targeted the future. We became the in-house design firm for a new generation of tech giants who saw the Vance brand as a relic of their parents' world. Our first major contract was designing the entire global headquarters for Nexus, the world's biggest AI company. The contract was worth $100 million. Vance had been the front runner. They lost it because their proposal was 50% marketing fluff and 30% more expensive. Ours was pure function, sustainable design, and brutal efficiency. The industry was stunned. An article in Forbes ran with the headline, "The Ghost of the Future: How Mysterious Newcomer Petrova Made Vance Irrelevant Overnight." Julian, in an interview, was predictably arrogant. Petrova is a passing fad, he scoffed. It's cold, soulless furniture for people who live in sterile boxes. The Vance name means warmth, legacy, family. Family. The word was a slap in the face, but it only fueled my focus. I used my intimate knowledge of my father's business as a weapon. I knew the artisans he had cherished, the small family-run suppliers Isabel had bullied and squeezed for better margins. I went to them one by one. I offered them partnership contracts, creative input, and most importantly, the respect my father had once given them. An old Italian leather worker, a man named Marco, who had supplied Vans for 40 years before being replaced by a cheaper factory in Asia, wept when I showed him my designs. "This," he said, running a hand over a blueprint, "is the work of someone who understands the material. It has a soul." Within a year, I had co-opted the very heart of the Vans supply chain. Their quality began. I offered them the one thing Julian couldn't: creative freedom. The Vans design department began to hemorrhage its best people. A slow, quiet bleed that went unnoticed by a leadership team obsessed with stock prices and celebrity endorsements. Isabel, however, was no fool. She felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. She couldn't understand how this phantom competitor knew exactly where to strike, how they could anticipate their moves, how they could so perfectly exploit every weakness. I heard through Silas that she had hired a private investigation firm to uncover the identity of Lena Petrova. The thought sent a chill down my spine, but it was too late. I was already too well insulated, my identity shielded by layers of corporate legal structures built by Silas. I was a ghost, just as he'd intended. The real twist, the moment this stopped being about my own pain, came from an unexpected source. I had hired a man named David, a master woodworker who had been my father's right hand in the workshop before Julian fired him. One evening he came to my office, his face grim. He'd kept in touch with some of his old colleagues, and the whispers from the Vance production floor were troubling. He handed me a thumb drive. "My friend in accounting is worried," he said. "Things don't add up. He thinks you should see this." That night, alone in my glass-walled office overlooking the city, I opened the files. It was a labyrinth of internal Vance financial reports, invoices, and supplier contracts from the last 2 years. At first, I was just looking for inefficiencies to exploit. But then I saw it, a pattern. Massive, recurring payments to 3 shell corporations with no public profile for design consulting and raw material sourcing. These weren't just inflated invoices, this was a sophisticated system of embezzlement. Isabel and Julian weren't just running my father's company into the ground with their incompetence. They were actively gutting it, siphoning millions of dollars out of the legacy he had spent his life building. This was no longer just about the theft of my inheritance. It was grand larceny on a corporate scale. I leaned back in my chair, the city lights blurring into a meaningless smear. The cold fire of revenge that had driven me for 2 years was suddenly replaced by a sickening, urgent clarity. I had set out to build a rival empire out of spite, but what I found in their numbers, in the secret language of their greed, was a crime. My war of revenge was about to become a rescue mission. An invitation arrived at my office on a thick, cream-colored card, the Vance family crest embossed in gold. They were throwing a party to celebrate a lie. The Metropolitan Museum of Art was hosting the annual Design Guild Awards, and this year, the coveted Innovator of the Year prize was being awarded to Julian Vance, an award his mother had undoubtedly purchased for him with a hefty donation. The gala was a monument to their arrogance, a lavish celebration of my stolen legacy. I looked at the invitation, at the name of my father twisted into a brand for their vanity, and I knew my 2 years in the shadows were over. It was the perfect venue to tell the truth. I spent a week preparing, not for a party, but for a battle. Silas had connected me with a couturier who worked exclusively with his firm, a woman who treated fabric like architecture. She created a gown for me of dark gray silk that moved like liquid smoke. It was severe, minimalist, and elegant, with a single sharp line of silver embroidery that snaked up my spine, a nod to the Petrova logo. My hair was slicked back, my makeup was stark. When I looked in the mirror, Alara was gone. I saw a woman I barely recognized, a face carved from grief and purpose. Lena Petrova was ready for her debut. The museum's main hall was dripping with excess. Towering floral arrangements suffocated the air with the scent of lilies. A string quartet played Vivaldi, but their music was drowned out by the braying laughter of the city's elite. And at the center of it all, like spiders in a golden web, were Isabel and Julian. Julian, preening in a velvet tuxedo, was surrounded by fawning reporters. Isabel, draped in diamonds that seemed to feed on the light, held court with the museum's board of directors. They looked untouchable, radiant in their success, the absolute monarchs of their glittering hollow kingdom. I arrived not through the main entrance, but through a private one, arranged by Silas, who was a primary patron of the museum. I entered the hall from the side, a quiet slipstream of grey in a sea of color. At first, no one noticed, but then a few heads turned. The whispers started, rippling through the crowd. "Is that her?" "That's Lena Petrova." The one from Petrova? The enigmatic ghost had materialized, and the energy in the room shifted. I felt their eyes on me, a current of curiosity and speculation. I ignored them. I had only two targets. I found Julian near the champagne fountain. He was telling a rapt audience an exaggerated story about the inspiration for his latest collection. He saw me approaching, and his story faltered. He didn't recognize me, not even a flicker. He just saw a woman he perceived as a rival, an equal, and he straightened his bow tie, his ego puffing up. "Miss Petrova," he said, detaching himself from his sycophants and intercepting me. "I'm surprised to see you here. I didn't think this was your scene." "I came to admire the architecture," I replied, my voice cool and even. I let my eyes drift over a gaudy, gilded chaise lounge from his new collection that was on display nearby. An interesting piece. It's beautiful, but it would collapse under any real weight. The confident smirk on his face evaporated. A cloud of confusion, then alarm, passed over his features. He knew exactly which sketchbook I was talking about. It was one of my father's most private, one that he and I had studied together, one that was supposed to be locked in the study. I don't know what you mean," he stammered. "Don't you?" I gave him a small, cold smile and walked away, leaving him standing there, his face pale, the seed of impossible familiarity planted in his mind. My next target was Isabel. She was standing by the grand staircase, and when she saw me, her polite smile became fixed and rigid. She had felt my presence the moment I entered the room. A predator always recognizes another. "Miss Petrova," she said, her voice like chilled champagne. "What an unexpected pleasure. I must confess, I'm an admirer of your aggressive business strategy." "And I yours, Mrs. Vance," I said, stopping before her. "It takes a special kind of vision to manage assets so creatively. I was just reviewing my own company's supply chain logistics. It's fascinating what you can find in the details. The quiet little companies that do the most important work. Ethel Consulting, for instance, or Crestlight Holdings, very discreet, very profitable." I watched the name of her shell corporations land. It was a direct hit. Her mask didn't slip, but a glacial panic flared deep in her eyes. The blood drained from her face, leaving two perfect circles of rouge standing out on her cheeks. She knew. She didn't know how I knew or who I was, but she knew that the ghost haunting her business was standing in front of her, and that it held the evidence of her crimes. Before she could respond, the master of ceremonies took the stage, his voice booming through the hall. He began his gushing introduction for the innovator of the year. Julian, having regained some of his composure, made his way towards the stage. Silas appeared at my elbow, a silent, imposing shadow. "The host has been informed that a surprise guest presenter, a patron of the arts, wishes to say a few words," he murmured, his voice laced with grim satisfaction. "The stage is yours when you are ready." I watched Julian climb the steps, the applause of the crowd washing over him. He walked onto the stage, a celebrated genius, bathed in the warm glow of 1,000 lights. Her eyes shining with the possessive pride. She was not just a proud mother, she was a victorious queen, admiring the spoils of her conquest. "Thank you," Julian began, his voice smooth and practiced, resonating through the grand hall. To be recognized for innovation is the highest honor, because innovation is about the future. When I took on the creative leadership of the Vance Design House, my goal was to honor the past while bravely stepping forward. My stepfather, Arthur Vance, was a man of immense talent, a true traditionalist. I only hope that I have managed to build upon his incredible legacy, to carry that torch into a new and exciting era. He paused, letting the weight of his false modesty settle over the room. It hasn't always been easy. There are those who resist change, who cling to the past, but progress demands courage. As he spoke, I felt a stillness settle over me. The years of pain, of struggle, of relentless work had all led to this single point in time. This was not about revenge anymore. It was about restoration. It was about justice. Julian finished his speech with a flourish and another round of thunderous applause. As the clapping began to subside, the host stepped back to the microphone. Thank you, Julian, a true innovator. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we have a surprise. A special patron of the arts, a visionary in her own right, has asked to say a few words to commemorate this occasion. Please welcome the founder of the Petrova Design House, Miss Lena Petrova. A confused murmur rippled through the audience. Julian, who had started to walk off stage, rose. His head snapped in my direction as I walked out of the wings and into the spotlight. Isabel shot to her feet, her face a white mask of fury and dawning horror. She knew. She didn't know how, but she knew this was the checkmate. I reached the podium and adjusted the microphone, my movements calm and deliberate. The hall was utterly silent. Good evening, I began, my voice clear and steady, amplified throughout the cavernous space. I'd like to add my congratulations to Julian Vance. It takes a unique talent to build a brand as powerful as the one he has curated. I let that hang in the air for a moment. I am here tonight to talk about legacy and about truth. True design, like true legacy, is not about the cameras in the room swiveled between me and the screen. A beautiful piece of work full of inspiration. Then, the image on the screen zoomed in, focusing on the bottom right corner of the page. My handwriting was clear. Ilara Vance, August 2021. Next to it, in my father's familiar scrawl, was a note. The tension is perfect, kiddo. Let's build it, Dad. A collective gasp went through the audience. Before they could recover, the screen changed again. Another design, another of Julian's signature pieces, and another page from my sketchbook, dated, signed, and annotated. One by one, I presented them: the ascend table, the stasis lamp, the sanctuary sofa. His entire career, his celebrated genius, deconstructed in a calm, methodical, and undeniable presentation of visual evidence. I was not just making an accusation, I was providing the receipts in front of a live global audience. With the final image still burning on the screen behind me, I turned my attention from the audience and looked directly at the man standing paralyzed just a few feet away. Julian Vance is a master of marketing, a brilliant salesman, I said, my voice ringing with a terrible clarity. But he is not a designer. He is a thief. He and his mother, Isabel Vance, built their empire on a foundation of lies, on a forged will, and on the stolen work of the daughter they cast out into the street 3 years ago. I paused, letting the weight of the accusation settle, letting every person in that room and everyone watching at home understand the depth of the fraud. Then I delivered the final blow. My name is not Lena Petrova, I said, my voice dropping slightly, becoming more personal, more real. My name is Elara Vance, and I have come back to reclaim my story. The room erupted. It wasn't just noise, it was a physical shockwave of sound, a roar of disbelief, scandal, and excitement. Phones and cameras were thrust into the air, their flashes like 1,000 silent explosions. Reporters were shouting. Julian stood as if he'd been turned to stone, his face a horrifying collage of disbelief and ruin. Isabel was screaming his name, trying to push her way through the crowd towards the stage, her elegant composure utterly shattered. But for the first time in 3 years, standing in the bright, unforgiving light, I felt absolute silence, the silence of truth. An empire built on lies is a house of glass. I had just thrown the first stone. The sound of it shattering was dead. Security guards had to help him off the stage, shielding him from a sudden, blinding wall of camera flashes. Isabel, however, fought. She was a cornered queen spitting venom. Lies! She's mentally unstable! Slander! She shrieked, trying to get to the stage, her diamond necklace swinging like a pendulum. But no one was listening. Her power had been built on a carefully constructed facade of grace and control. And now that the facade was cracked, they could all see the ugly, desperate thing it had been hiding. Former allies, the ones who had been kissing her hand an hour before, now averted their gazes and melted back into the crowd, creating a quarantine zone of scandal around her. Silas Blackwood moved to my side, a silent, formidable anchor in the storm. A reporter from the Times shoved a microphone in his face. "Mr. Blackwood, did you know who she was?" Silas looked down at the reporter with glacial disdain. "I invested in talent and in truth," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "It seems they are one and the same." With that single sentence, he conferred his immense credibility upon my story, and Isabel's fate was sealed. The next 48 hours were a blur of exploding headlines and cascading consequences. "The Vance deception!" screamed the Wall Street Journal. "Ghost in the machine! The secret heir who toppled an empire," read the cover of Design Weekly. The story was irresistible. A secret daughter, a forged will, a brilliant revenge. My father's old friends and craftsmen began to come forward, their voices joining a chorus of validation. They told reporters stories of Isabel's cold ambition, of Julian's ineptitude, of the talented daughter who had been their father's true apprentice. The narrative I had seized on that stage was now being cemented in the public consciousness. The corporate fallout was swift and brutal. As the markets opened the next morning, Vance Design House stock plummeted by 70%. The board of directors, many of whom had witnessed the debacle at the gala, convened an emergency session. My lawyers, instructed by Silas, delivered a package to them. It contained not only the proof of my stolen designs, but also the meticulously documented evidence of Isabel and Julian's embezzlement, the shell corporations, the fraudulent invoices, the systematic siphoning of millions. Their decision. He wasn't calling to threaten me or to deny anything. He was calling to confess. I used to watch you and your father in the workshop, he said, his words catching in a sob. You spoke a language I could never understand. I was so jealous. My mother, she always told me it was my birthright, that I just had to take it. But I always knew every time I put my name on one of your designs, I felt like a fraud. I never thought it would end like this. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was simply a hollowed out man, finally admitting the truth to the only person who had ever really known it. It was a pathetic, wretched, and deeply human sound. In that moment, he wasn't a monster. He was just a weak boy who had been eaten alive by his mother's ambition. It wasn't the satisfaction of victory I felt, but the quiet, aching tragedy of it all. I never heard from Isabel again. Her punishment was absolute. The public humiliation, the loss of status, the exile from the world she had fought so viciously to conquer. For her, it was a fate worse than any prison. The last I saw of her was a grainy paparazzi photo online, a woman in dark glasses, looking frail and old, a ghost of a different sort. Then, on the third day, the call came. It was from Robert Sterling, the new chairman of the board at Vance Design House. He was a man my father had respected, one of the few who had been pushed out by Isabel. His voice was grim. Elara, he said, the name feeling both strange and familiar. The company is on the verge of collapse. The brand is toxic. Investors are pulling out, and our credit lines are frozen. It's over unless someone can restore the integrity of the Vance name. He paused. The board has voted unanimously. We want you to come back, not as a designer, as CEO, to take control of your father's legacy. The empire of glass had shattered, and now they were standing in the ruins, holding a broom and a dustpan, asking me to walk back in and try to piece it all back together. The revolving doors of the Vance Tower felt different this time. 3 years ago, I had been thrown out into the cold. Today, I walked in as the queen returning to a conquered castle, only to find it was a kingdom in ruins. The lobby, once a gleaming testament to success, now felt stale and nervous. Employees scurried past, their eyes downcast, the air thick with the uncertainty of a company, its curves still waiting for a final sanding. It felt like a lifetime ago. I called an all hands meeting, not in the sterile corporate auditorium, but right there, in the workshop. The old craftsman I had already rehired stood beside the nervous younger employees who had survived the recent chaos. I stood beside my father's workbench, the scent of cedar and turpentine, a comforting ghost. My name is Elara Vance, I began, my voice echoing in the quiet room. Many of you knew my father, Arthur. You knew what he believed in, that the grain of the wood is as important as the polish, that the integrity of a joint is more important than a profit margin. For the past few years, this company lost its way. It forgot that we don't just make furniture, we tell stories, we build legacies. I looked at the faces before me, a mix of hope and skepticism. That ends today. We are going to rebuild, but we are not going back. We are moving forward. I took a deep breath. I am announcing a merger. The Vance Design House will formally merge with Petrova. We are combining the soul and tradition of Vance with the innovation and honesty of Petrova. We will be a new company, one that honors its roots but is not afraid of the future. We will build things that are beautiful, sustainable, and true. We will become the company my father always dreamed this could be. In the weeks that followed, we began the slow, difficult work of healing. I promoted David, the woodworker who had given me the financial records, to head of production. I flew to Italy and signed an exclusive multi-generational partnership with Marco, the old leatherworker, making him a celebrated part of our brand story. The changes were radical. We opened our books, implementing a transparent accounting system. We invested in sustainable materials and ethical supply chains. We turned the top floor executive suite, Isabel's old throne room, into a collaborative design studio for our entire creative team. One evening, Silas came to visit the revitalized workshop. He watched as a young designer and an old craftsman debated the curve of a chair leg, their shared passion bridging the 70-year gap between them. "You didn't just win, Lena," he said, using the name he was still most comfortable with. "You've created something better." He was right. The fire of my revenge had burned away the rot, but what was growing from the ashes was something new and beautiful. I realized my victory wasn't the moment I exposed hashtag Fatima Meta Force. 6.05 nothing. Isabel's punishment was the silence, the irrelevance. They had sought power over others and were left with nothing. I had been forced to find power in myself, and in doing so had been given everything. I stood by the window of my father's old study, the small carved wren he'd given me resting in my palm. I had fulfilled my promise. I had protected his legacy by first destroying the lie it had become, and then rebuilding it into a truth that could stand the test of time. A young intern knocked on the door, holding a blueprint, her eyes wide with a mix of nervousness and excitement. "Miss Vance, I have an idea." I smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. "Come in," I said, gesturing to the chair beside me. "Show me. Let's build it together." If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt like your voice was stolen or your path was blocked by someone else's ambition, let me know in the comments below. What I learned is that the most powerful revenge isn't about tearing someone else down. It's about having the courage to build yourself up, piece by broken piece, into someone who is unbreakable. Like this video if you believe in the power of resilience, and subscribe for more stories about fighting for your truth. Because sometimes the only way to reclaim your story is to write a new ending, one that is truer and stronger than you ever could have imagined.